Welcome back to the Automation Podcast, the world's #1 industrial automation product and technology show. Thanks to you, our audience of highly skilled automation professionals. Thank you for being a member of our audience, and thank you for tuning back in today. Now, if you're new to the show, my name is Sean Tierney from Insights in Automation, and this week on the show, we have a very special guest, Kyle from Inductive Automation, who is so gracious to meet with me after hours and introduced me to Ignition. Now, if you remember, many years ago, we had Inductive come on the show and kind of give that overview of the product. But what Kyle's going to do is actually teach us how to use it. Now, he is a professional instructor for Inductive Automation, and he reached out to me after the reader surveys and said, Sean, can I come on your show and show people how to use it? And of course, if you guys want professional training on how to program Ignition, of course, Kyle is a full-time instructor at Inductive Automation, so you can definitely contact them directly about signing up for one of those courses. But in the meantime, Kyle has agreed to come on the show and give us a rundown of like the first steps you take to get started with Ignition. I'm very excited about this. Now, because this is something I wanted to do and Kyle agreed to do it with me after hours, this is not sponsored by Inductive Automation. So therefore, our members who pay $5 a month or more at either YouTube or theautomationblog.com will have full access to the video for the life of their membership. But just like with our other podcasts, the audio edition is free to the entire world. And I did try to make an effort to make sure we describe it because I know even members like to listen to the show when they're either walking the dog or driving to work or doing something else. So in any case, we try to be very descriptive on what's happening on the screen if you're just listening to the show. And in addition to that, I did want to throw out a quick word here about my full-time job over at theautomationschool.com. If you know anybody looking for PLC or HMI training, you guys know right now I do Siemens and Allen Bradley. If you know anybody looking for that, please let them know. I have online courses, of course, for over a decade. I've been doing online training at theautomationschool.com. And I have over 35 years experience in the industry. And I also, for the last year, have been doing in-person training in my Berkshire, Massachusetts training center. So if you guys want to come in and do some hands-on, and if you want to do something custom, like want to do half a day of, getting started with Allen Bradley, and then half a day getting started with Siemens, or maybe half a day on the PLC, half a day on the HMI, just let me know. Again, if you know anybody looking for PLC HMI training, please mention theautomationschool.com because that is my full-time job. And with that said, let's go ahead and jump into this week's episode of the Automation Podcast. Kyle, thank you for agreeing to come on the show. I am really looking forward to learning more about Ignition. But before we jump into what you're going to show us today, could you just take a moment to tell people who you are?
Yeah, Sean, absolutely. And thanks again so much for having me on. I really appreciate you having these conversations and taking the time to include me. So, hey everyone, my name is Kyle. I work at Inductive Automation on our training team. I work with Ignition. I teach Ignition as a trainer. I've been with the company for about 4 years. I graduated right at the kind of peak of the COVID pandemic in 2020 and was looking for really any job related to tech and the supply chain. And I, of course, got very lucky finding Inductive Automation that produces Ignition SCADA and really intersects the supply chain and so many different industries that I've had the privilege of getting to know both in my time supporting the software and support and now in my time teaching people who are learning the software in training. Today, we're going to be really doing a learning-oriented demo of how to get started with the Ignition SCADA HMI platform. Here on the podcast, I do think most of us know what SCADA HMI is, and many of us likely have heard of Ignition. But what I really want to highlight in this video and conversation is how easy it is to get started learning and developing with Ignition. And as we kind of install it and get it set up, we'll naturally be covering a few of the basics about what is Ignition, why would you use it, how does it serve a purpose within the industrial stack. So I'm going to be doing kind of a longer spiel about what Ignition is as we install it, just to have something to talk about while we install. But I am going to give a really short, brief intro to get everyone on the same page here. So Inductive Automation makes Ignition. Ignition is a SCADA HMI development platform. That means what I'm about to download and install for everyone to see is a development platform that has no correct answer immediately available. You have to develop the solutions you want for your HMI SCADA needs. For your industrial automation needs at this point, Ignition is a lot more than just HMI and SCADA. It's resolving problems in all sorts of spaces in the industrial automation space, not only SCADA, HMI, but MES, ERP, and really just acting as that connection hub, connecting any data point you can really imagine, whether it be a PLC tag to actual databases, SQL or NoSQL. Ignition will kind of serve as our center for IIoT and industrial automation work. So people have likely heard about it. They know probably that it is free for people to download and trial. You can go to inductiveautomation.com, and I'm going to really validate this for all of us by proving that we can install and demo Ignition for free at any time on our home computer, maybe on a work computer, on a dev server. The main lesson I really want everyone to understand is that there is no excuse to not learning Ignition right now. It's all available for you whenever you need it. So if you go to inductiveautomation.com, naturally you can find a download button to download Ignition. Just because I don't want to waste your time with internet downloads, I have already downloaded it, but you would be able to download by clicking on the download button. And then if it is your first time downloading, we do typically ask that you give us some info about yourself. But if you're just like a student, if you don't actually have, useful info to give us, you can download without giving us any info at all. And what you'll end up getting is the Ignition installer. So again, I already did this. I'm going to go ahead and run it on the other screen real quick, and I'll pull up that installer as it activates to give us the experience of what does it mean to set up Ignition for the first time if I wanted to test it and develop with it. How could I start, gaining some Ignition chops and knowledge all on my own without spending any money, without investing anything other than my own time. So as the installer starts to activate, I will pull it over and explain the install process. But I do want to kind of explain that what we are installing is the Ignition server, the Ignition gateway. And what this means is that Ignition is a server-based platform. When you install Ignition, it does exist on either a box or it exists in the cloud or on a virtual machine. So here we go. I'm pulling it up now. My installer is open, and it's welcoming us to the Ignition install process. By installing my Ignition server, I will have Ignition running in the background, which will allow me to start to develop my Ignition applications. Your Ignition server is really the brains of your operation. It's going to hold all of the Ignition projects, tags, and resources that you've made. And then other users will be able to connect to your Ignition server, your Ignition gateway, and load the same projects or work and design on the same projects as you. As your teams grow, as your organizations grow, Ignition can scale along with it. So we could obviously choose different install locations as we install Ignition. But really one thing I want to highlight as we start to install our Ignition server is the fact that Ignition, one of its main selling points, is that it is modular. It is a modular platform, meaning you're really only including and paying for the tools and the features that you need. There are some inherent built-in functionality and features in Ignition. Like all Ignition systems will have the ability to create a database connection. But different parts of the Ignition server are going to be essentially customizable with modules. So what we can actually see now on my screen, as I'm progressing through the Ignition installer, is the second option we immediately get is the ability to change the default modules included on our initial install. And this is quite significant because every Ignition server will probably have a different set of modules. You only need the modules that you're actually going to use. You're only going to pay for the modules you're actually going to use. So modules do allow us, of course, to save a bit of money, not paying for unused features, and to build the Ignition platform that's right for your needs. What I'm showing here on the screen.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. What I'm showing here on the screen is the list of the default modules that are installed on any new Ignition server. These are really the most common modules that people often run into, but none of them are required. None of them are something that you have to include. They are really just the default modules that people often want to test list to start with, and you could therefore turn off anything you don't need.
I want to throw out there that for anybody who's listening, I know a lot of you, even on YouTube, listen to these shows. There's a lot of drivers in here. So, would you need the Allen Bradley, the Siemens, the BACnet, the Micro 800, Mitsubishi, Modbus, Umra. You probably wouldn't need all those on the same server unless you were like just this development king and you supported all those PLCs. So I could see unticking some of those definitely.
Yeah, absolutely, Sean. For your own demo test environment, I think it's fine to leave all of the default modules so you can test
Mhm.
with different things. But if you're trying to say simulate your actual environment, then go talk to your clients, go talk to your actual organization and identify what are the modules we have, and you can replicate your own system. These modules we see are not all of the modules that are available for Ignition. These are really just the default ones that we typically recommend. There's always going to be more modules we can find online. This isn't necessarily a module showcase. We are going to be using some of the uh, core modules that people typically almost always use, and that is going to be Perspective, which is our newer visualization module built for mobile oriented HMI development that uses HTML5 and CSS. But you could be someone who simply doesn't use Perspective and instead uses the Vision visualization module, which has been out a little longer and is more of maybe a more classic standard HMI that you might expect for like an on device type of HMI panel. Vision and Perspective are both visualization modules that serve similar purposes, displaying HMI screens, but since they have a different tech stack, they serve entirely different purposes, and therefore you don't need both of them in a lot of cases. Many people do use both, but some people only use one or the other. There's many of these kind of ideas with Ignition modules where certain features between them will have some overlap, and therefore you potentially don't need both of them.
Are they purchased separately? I mean, when I go to purchase Ignition, right? So I'm used to the classic HMI where you buy package X and you kind of get this suite of things, graphics, alarms, trends. And I'm just not sure where with inductive automation, when I buy the standard edition, what do I get?
That's a good question. And I'm training, so ultimately, whenever it comes to a question, when it comes to sales, I will usually try and refer it back to an actual salesperson, as I
Mhm.
don't like to misquote anything. One thing that I do think is pretty cool in terms of pricing out your Ignition license is there is a license calculator on the website. So you can actually kind of mix and match and select the modules you're
Okay.
expecting and kind of look
Mhm.
at those, maybe pre-made packages, if you might think of them that way, Sean,
Mhm.
for packages that people often get together. So it is something that is so subjective. I won't necessarily say I have a direct answer for how much are you going to pay. I'm going to send you instead to the calculator. Or, of course, if it's a big sale, maybe directly to your sales rep. Uh, there are potentially, discounts for integrators. So the pricing calculator, if you're just looking on it casually online, may not even be exactly correct for your situation if you're a company working with us closely. But that is really the starting point for how would you identify, what is going to be the cost of my Ignition license. I wouldn't
Mhm.
necessarily take anyone's word for it online. I would try and do it yourself with the calculator, just
Mhm.
because everyone is getting that different Ignition experience, that different Ignition's license with the different modules. And there is no universal correct answer for what is the correct license. But you are kind of alluding to a very important question of like what should we be approaching as a standard Ignition system, right? Should we
Mhm.
be looking for? And it's one of those answers that I know a lot of people don't necessarily like, but it really is. It depends, right? Ignition is so modular and so scalable at this point that there are at this point entirely different Ignition additions that completely alter some of the rules that I've been outlining in terms of how Ignition functions.
Mhm.
So I actually do want to talk about this for a moment. One of the last things you do when you install your Ignition server, which again we're doing for free, we're downloading for free, is you are going to choose your Ignition edition. There are technically four editions, even though we only see three here. That's because there's a newer cloud edition available on your cloud marketplaces. When we're installing Ignition on a server, though, we have these three options, which is the standard edition or the Edge and the Maker editions. The standard edition is what most actual production facilities are using for their main central server, the server that would be connecting to your databases, perhaps sending your alarms and your emails. So then, of course, you may be wondering, what would the Edge and the Maker edition be for? The Edge edition is for lightweight edge of network communications. It's for getting your edge devices connected to your central SCADA network. So it is a much lighter weight version of Ignition. There's less going on with it. It has more restrictions and limitations and is therefore cheaper because the point of it is to exist out at the edge and connect to your main standard or maybe your cloud edition. And then the Maker Edition is, of course, just for fun. That's for home automation for people who want to, automate and develop in the home, automate your lights, your sprinklers, your garage doors, whatever you currently have available to connect to. We will, of course, be using standard for this demo, just to kind of show the default features of Ignition. I will agree to the end user license agreement, and I'm going to do, unfortunately, something very bad practice, have a very short password and a terrible username, just to make this faster for me to log in. So the final steps I'm doing here just to complete my setup process for Ignition is really just setting a password and choosing that standard edition. Everything else is really just leaving things as default, but you have a little bit of control over, for example, the ports Ignition is using. So I did talk through that, right? We could have done that a lot faster. Typically installing Ignition, once you know what you're doing, will take under 3 minutes. It might take some time to download it if your internet isn't the greatest, but it is free to download. So as I've been saying, there's really no excuse not to start learning it right now if it's something that you're interested in or that's being asked of you. As we start our Ignition server, what's happening is the Ignition gateway is turning on. And the Ignition gateway is the brains of our operation. It's where we're going to be able to develop all of our resources, where we're going to be able to connect to our PLCs and our databases. Ignition is, of course, a connection hub for your SCADA HMI systems, and it does need to be able to connect to all of the different tools and technologies we want to use in industrial automation. So the most standard, of course, would be PLCs and databases. But Ignition acts as a web server, so you have access to really anything you can touch on the web. We could be sending to and pulling data from APIs, as well as databases, like your classic SQL. For someone who installed Ignition for the first time, the last thing you're going to end up seeing is a pop-up as your Ignition loads asking you if you want to enable a quick start. A quick start is just an example project that may actually be useful for those of us out there that are new and wanting to learn Ignition. But really, you can also do all of the quick start stuff yourself and just build resources. So I'm actually just going to say no thanks. I'd like to start from scratch. So what we've actually demoed right now was the install of Ignition. My laptop I'm using is getting a little older, so it took a little longer than some of us might experience when installing Ignition, or for example, if we were using Docker to spin up Ignition in a container. But at the end of the day, we're getting here to the Ignition Gateway web page. This is actually a fantastic page to be on because not only is it going to give us access to all of the tools that we're going to use for Ignition, but if we scroll down just a tiny bit, it actually links to more resources for learning Ignition, which is what I'm going to end up mentioning at the very end once we've seen it a bit in action. So the Gateway web page is a web interface for controlling your Ignition server, and it's where you can control and maintain some of the highest level settings, as well as see things like your status information, which I will need to log into to see. It does have some default security set up. So I could see some information about, the performance of my gateway, what I have connected to my Ignition server, like the databases or the devices. And of course, Ignition is both an OPC client and an OPC server. Depending on the modules you have included, you can have Ignition act as an OPC UI server itself, or instead act as an OPC client pulling from another OPC UI server, or even a bit of both. In order to start making connections in Ignition, which is something I know a lot of us will want to do right away, we would go to the Gateway web page configuration tab, which is the third tab available on the Gateway web page once you install it. There are going to be a lot of options. I won't be able to talk about all of them in this short little demo, but it's worth noting that everything in Ignition is, of course, well documented in our user manual, so we could go read about these in our online public documentation, even if we didn't have someone explaining them to us out loud. The one thing I really want to highlight right now is where would we go to connect a PLC? Right? That's almost always one of the first things we're going to want to do with a SCADA HMI system. We need relevant data to look at. In this config tab, since we do have the OPC UA module, we do have the ability to make OPC-UA device connections and have Ignition bring in those OPC-UA devices. So I'm in the Ignition Gateway webpage, and I'm able to find the configuration tabs for, in this case, creating a new device. In this demo, I am going to use simulated devices because one thing I really want to drive home is the fact that there's no excuse for learning Ignition. For not learning it, I mean. There's no excuse for not learning Ignition. Even if you don't have a PLC available, you could simulate OPC data and still develop SCADA and HMI resources as practice. You can connect to your PLC when you actually get approval or when you actually have one to test with. So let's say we were connecting to a PLC. We would end up coming here to this config create devices page. We'd click create, and then depending on the modules we have installed, we would see different options for connecting to our devices. Since I'm using a default install, I have a lot of options. So for example, maybe we had a Logix controller that we wanted to connect to using firmware V21 Plus. Obviously, we see there's a lot more options. So we choose the option that works for our device, and then we would click our next button down at the bottom. And for connecting to a device, it's really a networking issue when it comes to Ignition. It needs to be able to hit the host name of your device and find it on the local network. Assuming we had a device to connect to, we would be able to name our device and then fill out a host name. With valid data, we would be able to connect and create that connection using OPC-UA. That being said, I don't actually have a device on this laptop set up and ready to go. So instead, what I'm going to demonstrate is the Ignition Programmable Device Simulator, which is an option built into any Ignition install and is a really good option when you don't have devices available. The device simulator, if we create it, I'm going to name it Dairy because I'm going to import a dairy set of devices simulated from a fake dairy. With the device simulator, if you create an Ignition, you can edit it and then add custom instructions that will create OPC values that are changing in Ignition's OPC-UA server and effectively simulate OPC tags. I could therefore customize this to be exactly like my system and have realistic tag names and structures based on devices from my actual organization or my actual clients. We also have a few built-in programs that we've had for a long time simply for quick testing. So I'm going to load a dairy simulator, which is very simple. And if we see in the middle of our screen, it's generating simple tags, structures that represent tags in our OPC server that will be either static values or changing values based on various programs in the system. With this simulated device running in the background, this is as if we had connected to one or maybe multiple browsable OPC-UA PLCs. This would allow us to, at this point, start bringing in data from our devices, and then we could start to build SCADA HMI resources. There's a lot more you could change in the gateway in terms of settings like creating database connections, your security, etc. But I've started with just creating a device. Now I want to demonstrate how would we actually start making HMI and SCADA projects using these devices. In order to do that, we will have to install the designer. So this is actually another install. The designer is Ignition's application runtime for making changes to projects. So I'm running the designer installer now on my screen. It's very simple. I'm technically using my normal laptop, so I'm overriding the previous designer I've installed before. That probably wouldn't happen to you. But by installing the designer, we now have access to a tool that connects to Ignition servers and allows you to make changes to them. The reason this is significant is because anyone who has a network connection is able to install this designer, which you have now on my screen, and work on your Ignition gateway with you. So we can have any number of users collaborating together, building our SCADA HMI applications. Once you have your designer launcher installed, you will need to target your local server. In this case, since I've installed locally, I really only have my local server to deal with. But the point of the designer launcher is to give you access to any Ignition server that you have worked with or will work with so that you can work on the various projects across them. So although I've just connected to the one server I installed as our example, this launcher could have dozens of different designers for all of the different systems that we work on. I do finally, of course, have to log into the designer. And we're greeted with a new interface to create a project. Projects are the actual resources that we launch and interact with as end users. Our operators, our C-suite, they may use Ignition projects to look at data from our PLCs. They may use Ignition projects to control parts of machines, to change set points. Since this is a short demo, I'm going to make a quick project that I call motors. I'm going to just be demoing what would it take to create a variable HMI for a motor device. The tags that I imported earlier in the programmable to simulator are now available in Ignition. And as I create this new project, I'm going to be able to start immediately designing with those resources that are coming into the Ignition OPCUA server. There's a few other settings we could have changed related to the project, like what database it uses, if it's inheriting from other projects, for example. But I'm using just a default project. What this brings us to is the designer itself. Designer is a standalone application. I'm here in Windows loading my designer. But Ignition can be installed, and so can the designer on all of the common operating systems like Windows, Mac, and Linux. The designer interface is quite a lot to take in if you're new to it, and that's because it is the toolbox to develop your Ignition SCADA HMI platform. This is where you're going to be developing your tags to represent all of the data points from your devices, where you're going to be representing and making your HMI screens, where you can build Python scripting logic and named SQL queries that you can reuse throughout your system.
For anybody who's listening, this looks, you're going to be very comfortable in this. You got your project browser on the top left, and then all the way on the right, you have your palette of the like text areas and drop down lists and buttons and all that kind of stuff. So all your objects are on the right in a component palette, and everything seems to be organized really well. So just first time looking at this myself, I'm like, I feel pretty comfortable in it, and I feel like it's not something it's not something that's going to surprise you. It looks very well organized, and I'll turn it back to you, Kyle.
Yeah, definitely, Sean. I feel like this is really the home base for people who are designing in Ignition. You should feel pretty comfortable and kind of happy in the designer. This is where you're getting your work done. So you're absolutely right? The project browser is really our focal point of the designer. That is exactly the thing we want to be looking at most of the time. The project browser in the top left of our designer is telling us exactly what we're dealing with, what we're looking at. So as I move around the project browser, we can obviously see we have different resources to work on. So I talked about vision versus perspective. We can see that those two visualization modules are standalone options in the project browser, and you would therefore develop your different resources in these different parts of the project browser. This, of course, compares to, say, the tag browser, which is right below it, which is where you would develop your tags. And that's actually where I'm going to start because I want to represent some tags on a perspective HMI screen, and I want to demonstrate how quickly we can go from nothing to something done in Ignition, even with a minimal amount of experience. So we'll loop back at the end of this demo to talk about where we would be learning this, where our resources would come from as we try to learn Ignition. But I will be jumping through a bit of future demonstration here. So in the tag browser in our designer, since we had connected our device we have the ability to use the OPC UA browsability to look at any tags that come in to the Ignition OPC UA server via automatic OPC browsing. Not every device works this way, right? Certain devices can't browse via OPC UA, and you may have to do more manual addressing in that case, but a whole lot of modern devices can. So if you do have a modern device that's connected to your OPC UA server, immediately you will likely be able to drill into it and start looking at your tags. In this case, I'm drilling into our connected devices screen, and I'm finding within my dairy device that it's actually structured into really two areas, an overview and a refrigeration area. And then within those areas or those zones, we have repeated devices. For example, there are 8 different devices called a motor, and each of those devices has 2 tags, an amps and an HOA tag. Now, obviously, these devices are a bit abstracted to make things simple for classes and for this demo, but we could extrapolate this motor to be a little more realistic, have dozens to hundreds of tags. The number of tags is not exactly my focal point here. What I want to highlight is that we have repeated devices, something that a lot of us deal with out at production lines, production facilities where you have repeated production lines, or out in the field if we have repeated pumps, repeated wells. Ignition allows you throughout the entire system to leverage custom variables and parameters to save time designing resources. That's the main thing I'm going to be highlighting here. We can save time developing with Ignition by leveraging the parameterized nature and the structured nature of data. This, of course, means we do have to have a little bit of structure, so maybe you should actually start there if your PLCs aren't structured at all. But assuming you have some structure, like repeated motors in our case, we can leverage that information, in this case, the fact that each of our motors is a similar structure, to develop and create template-like resources, both in the HMI system and in the tag system, to quickly deploy any number of, in this case, our motors. So I could add tags manually and just create single OPC references, but the vast majority of time in Ignition, what you're going to be doing is creating your own user-defined type. A user-defined type is a structure that represents tags. In this case, if I create a new data type in my system that represents a motor, which I'm doing right now, I could name it motor definition. And what I'm doing is I'm creating a definition that represents any motor. And because it represents any motor, this means as we add new motors to our system, we're going to be able to quickly spin up new tags, new HMIs, and get people working on those devices right away. This is all going to be powered by parameters. Virtually everything in Ignition can be parameterized. Most of us know what a parameter is. It's a custom variable that we can control. And since we can control that parameter, we have the ability to change it. We have the ability to define different motors in this case, because the parameter I'm using is the motor number. What I can then do is I can browse my devices one more time to find an example motor, like a motor 1, and I can add the 2 tags from it. This may seem a little strange, just adding tags directly from motor 1, because I've just been describing making a variable resource. But by adding example tags, I now can look and see what amps from the motor would look like if it was motor 1. And more specifically, I can target and look at the OPC item path property. Since we're dealing with OPC tags here in Ignition, if I look at my tag and I identify this property, I can see it's actually referring to the node within the OPC address space that this tag is being tracked at. And what we can do in this special user-defined definition is we can control this path to represent different tags. I can actually replace, by editing my binding, the 1 that was originally there, the motor 1 number, and I can represent any motor number by inserting a variable parameter. So I'm now opening an interface called a binding interface that allows us to inject custom values, and in this case, we're literally overriding the path for the amps tag and now representing any motor at all. can do the same thing for HOA and create an entire definition that represents any motor number for amps and HOA tags, and therefore represents all 8 of our motors, allowing me to quickly go and create a new folder for them all. And I can then spin up 8 new instances using what's called the multi-instance wizard by spinning up 8 different instances of the motor using the pattern 1 to 8 to represent my motors 1 to 8. What I've done now by using the instance creation wizard is I've actually created tags. I now have 8 different tags that represent OPC motors coming directly from my device connection.
Can we
You
go
can,
back to the
yeah,
UDT definition for a minute?
yeah,
And
absolutely.
let's open that up. So on the left hand side, we have the type structure. So we have motor definition, that's what we called it. And under that, we have the 2 tags you added in, the amps and HOA. But when you added those in, they had a fixed path to the actual tags in the dairy simulated PLC. And what you did is you clicked, I believe you clicked on the link button
Yeah,
and
exactly.
edited. And what you did is you replaced the motor number 1 with motor, and then in squiggly brackets, you put in motor number. That was a variable you defined somewhere else. And you did that, you inserted that by that little, could you go to the right there? What is that? What do you call that little?
Yeah,
Yeah,
so I
right
call
there.
these helper buttons. This is just if you mouse over it, it calls it params. So it's just the
Parameters.
params
Yeah.
button, but I would call it the
And
parameter helper.
there's a lot of things in there, but one of the things in there is actually the motor number variable you created. Now, if you could jump out of that and show us again where you created that motor number.
Yeah, exactly. So that motor number is on the definition itself on the very top.
All right. Yep. It was there on, yep. One parameter. I got it. Yep. I see it. Okay. So very easy. It's like indirect addressing in a PLC,
Yeah,
um,
exactly.
and or parameters in other HMIs, SCADA packages. So thank you for going back through that. I just wanted to make sure I remembered that and understood that correctly.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm always happy to go over anything again. The motor creation, I'm doing it rather quickly to just demonstrate once you have these steps down, it is not going to slow you down. There's nothing in Ignition that's meant to slow you down. It's meant to be building upon all the resources you've made. And so highlighting this as well in perspective or vision, what we could do is take a resource like the motor and we could parameterize it into a screen. I could build a new perspective view. In perspective, our views are our HMI screens. They are the kind of unit of design. So I could have a new view that is for my motor, and I could make it a flex container. Perspective, since it's built using HTML and CSS, is potentially a bit different when you're designing it compared to, say, more of a classic XY drag and drop experience. Perspective uses flexboxes as one of the tools to create your views, your central units of design. And when you're designing with flexboxes, it is quite different than an XY container. So with the flexbox, if I wanted to, say, add a component to the top left and the bottom right, I can't actually do that. Right? I'm trying my hardest right now, Sean. I'm trying to put it in the bottom right,
I
and it
see.
just does
Yeah.
not work. And that's actually because up in the top right, we can see row and column is the first setting there.
Hmm.
Flex boxes are quite literally rows and columns. And the benefit of flexes is that they resize fairly elegantly across different screen sizes. But the drawback is we get this very different design experience that many of us aren't used to. So learning to design in perspective using the newer flex containers and other types of containers is really one of the newer, more uh, different experiences for anyone working with Ignition because it's not similar to working in Vision, and it's also probably not similar to working with other HMI systems that you've had experience with. So I do want to really just call our attention to that. I do have some experience with Flexes, so I already know how to kind of work with them. But if you are new to Perspective, if you're new to Ignition, there are going to be some resources online you could go and learn about Flex boxes generally unrelated to Ignition, because those aren't necessarily unique to us. They are a more modern front end web design that is applicable to varying screen sizes. So I'm going to quickly delete these 2 icons Because what I actually want to do here in this motor is create a smaller faceplate that represents my two tags, my motor HOA and amps. And this actually won't take us very long because all we need to do is build a single screen that represents all of our motors. And I can do this by, once again, creating a parameter. This time I'm creating it on the view. And by creating a similar motor number parameter, it doesn't have to be the same name. In fact, I'm going to name it motor number view just to really drive that home. Parameters are custom properties. You can name them whatever you want. It's useful to keep parameters in line and have them synchronize their names just so your users know what they are. But you can create your parameters anywhere on really any resource that you want to make dynamic in Ignition. So now with this view, this HMI resource being parameterized, I could start to add HMI resources using my component palette, and then of course dragging them on and, for example, adding a label. For this label, what I would want to do is again use a binding. Bindings are Ignition's special built-in feature to connect data points together. So you can bring in tag values to an LED with a binding. In this case, we can bring in a parameter value into another property in our label using a binding. Every single property, virtually every part of your components, can have a binding and therefore be changed dynamically, either by tags or by user input. Properties are really your entryway to value changes and hooking into any of your other aspects of Ignition. So in this way, what we're going to do is actually configure an expression property binding that allows us to simply combine the word motor and a space, so making a string that says the word motor and a space, and we'll use the plus to concatenate our view parameter that we've defined. And our view parameter is available in another helper button to see the properties that are defined within our view. Properties are really just the settings that make up everything in Ignition. So really, we're just looking at the settings of our resource. We're identifying the setting that we've created earlier. Motor number, I set it to 1. And I can now actually see in my preview that it's going to be showing motor 1 rather than the default label text. So just like that, we now have a label that's going to dynamically tie to that parameter. And this now represents any motor and will show a different label every time. But of course, that's just a label, right? Is that interesting? What I really want to be doing is getting to our tags. So the next thing I'm going to add is a multi-state button. Multi-state button is a component that just allows you to have multiple buttons on it and change the buttons as needed. You can set this up to therefore write to tags that are controlled via states. For example, HOA stands for handoff auto, and this example button's actually configured somewhat perfectly for that HOA tag I added to my motor device. So what I need to do is actually now bind the HOA tag for any motor to this button, which in Ignition is quite easy. Like I've been saying, almost anything in Ignition can be parameterized, can be made dynamic. In this case, it's an indirect tag binding, what I'm describing. We could use the multi-state button's value properties, and we could set up a binding on the value properties that allows the user to change the button and write all the way down to the tag value for HOA. We do this by setting up a binding. And once again, I like to target an example tag, kind of like what we did in the UDT. We can target an example HOA tag from our motors folder. These are the actual tags in my system. But of course, I don't want to statically target motor 1. I want to target the motor that is stored in the motor number view parameter. And finally, if I wanted to write to a tag through a component like this, we could check the bidirectional checkbox. And I'm going to copy my binding and paste it on indicator value. This multi-state button does have a two-part binding process so that we could have our indicator bound to, say a read command and then the control value bound to a write command if our PLC was set up in that way. I could then go into preview mode in my designer, which allows me to simulate a runtime and test directly in the design interface. In preview mode, I'm able to see that as I write to my button, right, we get this pending write attempt, and then the write comes through. We could always change our overlays if we didn't like them, if we wanted to turn off the pending overlay. And I can see in my tag browser, the tag that I'm bound to, the binding that I made, is writing to and updating my tag. So now not only do we have a label, we have a button that's changing as well.
So it's you put in there the motor number view variable, and yet when you play test it, where do we set the motor number view to default to 1?
Yeah, great question. So in this case, since we're dealing with a view, it is literally on the view. We would just click on motor and we could look down in our params, and maybe you want me to change it to 2. I could
I
change it
see
to
what
2
you're
right
saying.
here.
So that's its
And then,
default. Yeah.
yeah, it's the
So
default
yeah,
param. That's a very good question. And you may be
they're
wondering,
going
is
to
this?
show us how to pass that later
Yeah,
on.
exactly. Like, what
I
does this
got it. Okay,
default param mean? It doesn't really mean anything. It's just for testing, right? It's just so I
got
could
it.
see it here. This is always going to be overridden. 99% of the time, you're going to override a parameter. That's really the whole point of them.
No,
So,
and I think that's good because I can
yeah,
test it. It makes it easy for me to test because with some other packages, you don't have that option.
yeah. So, in fact, you really should be testing, because if we had a null value or just a default value, we would actually be getting lots of errors on our screen right now. The label wouldn't make any sense. So this is just a default parameter. Don't worry about it being stuck on 2 or anything like that. We are going to be able to change this in a moment. I will add one more component, perhaps the LED display, and then maybe I'll add an image as well. The LED display I can connect to my amps. I'll do it a little bit faster, simply selecting an example amps tag, and then replacing in this case, 1, because that's the parameter I'm using. But it's really important to note the parameter could be anything, right? Especially in the modern day, we have the idea of standardizing your tag names using a more unified namespace. So if you have a structured system for all of your tags and you can then map that into Ignition, then you could imagine that actually a binding interface like this indirect binding I'm showing, could be all parameter references, right? We could have your default tag provider source followed by your enterprise ID, followed by your site ID, followed by
Mhm.
your zone ID. So
That's what
that's,
I was going to ask
yeah,
because
literally
typically we'd have
parameter.
at least 2.
Yeah.
We would have the PLC, and then we would have the motor number. So we can't put multiple
Yeah.
variables in there, correct?
Yeah.
Okay,
You can have as many as you want. This is a very simple example.
sure.
Nowadays in our tests and our classes, we're starting to use a stronger, more broader example that I typically describe as enterprise site area
Hmm.
line device tag, which aligns somewhat with common UNS structures. So I did the same dynamic binding for the LED display. Naturally, we could kind of keep doing this for as many tags as we needed, as many components as we needed. Uh, just the last thing I'll add for fun is just an image of a motor. We have Symbol Factory built in as an available small module if you like the Symbol Factory images. These aren't unique to Ignition. Symbol Factories in a lot of tools. If you're already familiar with them, we do have them in Ignition as well. So I'll pull in my
Yeah,
orange
if you
servo
don't
motor.
have the graphics, I definitely recommend it. Some packages I spent hours drawing simple images. So just check and make sure that I would just say get it at least for your first project.
Yeah, definitely. You can always do, SVGs and import them as well. You can import any
Hmm.
image you need in Ignition. So the last thing I'm going to do that is, again, a flex kind of specific property that's a little rare for us to deal with if we've never used a flex container before, is technically, since I'm in a flex box, all of these properties in my flex box, if I select them, they have a grow property. And I'm going to actually quickly demonstrate this before I change it. But if I resize my screen and I kind of make it a bit bigger, we start to see that there's that kind of a white space down at the bottom. It shows, the LEDs moving around a bit. But other than that, my components aren't actually really doing the whole thing that I described, which is elegantly resizing. And that's simply because by default, your flex components are not growing. They're set to grow 0. Grow is a special property that is a a relative ratio between the components to determine how should they be sharing white space. Should they be taking up any white space at all? By setting the grow to 1, I could do it from all my components. It will actually allow them to now stretch out and expand into the white space as we grow and shrink. And so we get a more elegant resizing. So again, this is a very simple introduction to flex boxes, but if those of us that were seeing the design and wondering, why would we deal with something that isn't as easy as XY? It's actually because of that resizing ability, so we can deal with our phone and our tablet and our laptop screens all at once. So now that I have a motor dynamic view made, something I could do is I could create a single page to represent many motors. I could create another view that will be my main page, and I'm going to represent a carousel component in it, which is a more advanced component that allows you to have multiple views at once. There's many, many ways in Ignition and in Perspective, especially where we can embed and display multiples of the same view we've created or different views together. So we're really building an HMI combined of all of these smaller template-like elements that are dynamic and power and work together to make a bigger and better system. So in this case, by adding a new carousel, I could go into my carousel and I could choose to show my motor in it. And I could choose to add my motor number. And maybe I'll start with motor 1. And then from here, I could just duplicate it if I had a very manual system, if I only ever had a few lines and we updated them very manually. Then doing things manually in the property editor is not the end of the world. And I could maybe duplicate it a few times and create 4 different motors, which allows me to now swipe between and see these different motors change their values.
So a carousel, you have like you would have on a web page, you get arrows going left and right. And can you navigate that with your you're dragging? Okay.
So yeah, I'm just dragging, and you have these little buttons. This is just the default carousel. You could tap
Sure.
in and hook in some more components if you want. You
And
could
so
have
you
an
added
auto
through.
scroll.
You have 4 total views. You just kept adding them in and changing the motor number, view number, and now you have the carousel, and you can just, which this would be great on a mobile device to quickly.
Yeah.
Yep.
And let's exactly kind of see what that would look like. I can, just from my runtime or my designer runtime, I can launch an actual user runtime, an end user runtime by going up to tools, launching a session. Although it will show me nothing because I've forgotten to save. So this is the last thing I kind of wanted to highlight, which is of course that by default, your Ignition project will immediately update as you push your save. So as we start to make changes, in this case, I have really nothing set up. My first save will come through. And now I have my project pushed in. And if we wanted to make changes on the fly, all we need to do is save and our projects will update. In this case, in our browser, since I'm using Perspective, I can actually tap in directly to my project from a web browser. We could imagine if this was, smaller on our phone, still going to work, just as elegantly as if it was larger.
And there is a selector at the bottom too, like you'd see on most web
Yeah.
pages for each of the carousel positions.
Yeah. So I know, obviously, Sean, it's just an intro demo. We haven't actually gotten in a lot of the really cool features people often want to get into with a SCADA system, like alarming, like history. What I really wanted to demonstrate is that once we install Ignition, you're unbounded. You're free to do as much as you need. You can develop as much as you want. This whole time we've been developing fairly unlimited with a standard Ignition install. We're working with Perspective and our OPC server. And the entire time, if we go back to our Gateway webpage, what we've been developing on is the trial mode. Ignition is free to trial. You can trial all of the modules you might expect to get from inductive automation, confirm things work for you, how you want, and then you can purchase a license when appropriate. This trial, as we can see, is just counting down, and every 2 hours, you will need to come here to this page, this web page, and you will need to click reset on this trial banner, and that is the limitation of the trial. What happens when your trial expires? Your tags stop updating is the main thing. Okay. So your tags will stop working, and then you'll notice it right away. It'll show some like red errors in certain places. But one thing it doesn't interrupt is your designer experience. You still get to design. You can keep saving. You can keep working. I personally always work on trial mode unless I'm teaching a class, because trial mode has no limitations on it. It is a full Ignition install. It's just turning it off every 2 hours until you activate your license. So everything that we've done here, everyone could go and demo for themselves right now. There's nothing locked away. You don't need to talk to anyone to demo any of this. And if what we've talked about, if the demo, how easy it is to get into it, hasn't piqued your interest, perhaps highlighting these final more resources will finally get you into looking into the Ignition ecosystem. So this is really the last thing I want to talk about here. In that gateway web page, which is the server we installed whenever you install Ignition, there is the Home tab, and there are these links to our various online resources. These are, of course, all available online on the internet, so you can also just search for them. You don't have to download anything to get to these, but they are excellent resources. There's the product documentation, which is, of course, the user manual. The user manual is quite extensive. Every single feature that we talked about, from perspective to tags to UDTs, is covered very in depth in the user manual. It has a great search feature. You could search for any of the things we've been talking about, or of course, just use the menu bar on the left to learn about different parts of the Ignition platform, like tags or like the designer, two of the features we were using. Additionally, the user manual will link often to Inductive University. Inductive University is our tutorial content library. There's dozens of hours of free, very short and concise tutorial videos related to learning Ignition. Inductive University, I'm already finished with it, has a great credential program, which allows you to really cover all of the key features of Ignition. And there's even now a new elective studies courses up in the schools tab, so you can learn more advanced things realistically, like how to get started with Docker or how to get started making your own Ignition modules. So we really love keeping people informed about Ignition. We love making things accessible to everyone here at Inductive Automation, and we are always going to keep adding more resources to the user manual and Inductive University, so there's always going to be more to learn, especially as new features come out. Those are really the two major places for new resources. But there's two other final things I want to mention, especially for the people listening to this podcast. Because if you're someone listening to this type of content, then you're someone already kind of tapped into the automation, the SCADA ecosystem. And then that it's the community and the people working in this industry that really sets us apart from perhaps others. There is collaboration, there is cooperation. People do help each other. And this is shown very evidently in the Ignition forums and the Ignition Exchange website. The forums are, of course, a forums website. I won't open it. It's pretty standard. The forums allow you to share and ask questions with other Ignition users, even with Inductive Automation employees. I'm in the forums sometimes. Developers will be in the forums. So it's a great way to just learn, get inspired, like it says here, by talking to the Ignition community. And then finally, Ignition Exchange is the last thing I really want to highlight, because I think if you don't know about it, then you are really missing out. The Ignition Exchange is a place where the community shares Ignition resources. So if we just open up the Exchange like I've done here, we could scroll down a little bit and see some of the resources, right? People are sharing resources like a time tracking application, which is actually very useful for integrators to keep track of how much time you're using on each project or each contract. But the really cool thing here is if you search for demo, what we have available are the Ignition 8 demo projects. This is a huge backup. You can back up Ignition, obviously, right? You can back up your stuff. You want to back up your stuff. And when you have backups of Ignition, you can restore them to spin up your system and interact with it again. We've shared with the community the Ignition 8 demo projects, which is our largest. It's demo.ia.io, our largest public perspective demo. It can be accessed by going to demo.ia.io. And if you wanted to simply understand how was this project made, what does the back end of this project look like, you can do that by going to the Exchange and downloading the Gateway Backup. So you can see how we made different screens like these for things like history and some of the cool demo apps, which I think are really great, like the automotive app. which will take you and let you see some really cool stuff that the sales engineering team at Inductive Automation made. That is, of course, in the Exchange. And all of these resources, like I've said, are linked and will always be linked on the home page of your Ignition gateway. So if you have Ignition installed anywhere right now, you have access to these very easily. You don't even have to remember them. They're always going to be on your Ignition homepage. These resources really let you take your passion for industrial automation and SCADA and potentially build a new skill with Ignition.
Well, that was excellent, Kyle. I really appreciate you coming on and showing us all this. It really gave us a good glimpse into actually building a project. And that's what I was hoping for. Not that I think I could build an entire project without a few more questions, but I think and I appreciate you focusing on the parameters and multi instances because I think just putting a value on the screen, pretty easy, but showing how you do that, that gives us some more insight in how that would be done. And that's really extremely popular in SCADA development and HMI development today is, using, you have all these objects in your controller that have UDTs. You want to leverage that in your SCADA package or HMI that simplify your programming tasks. And so I really appreciate you running through that and showing that. And I appreciate you for you coming on late tonight to record this session with me. Was there anything else you wanted to get across to the audience before I close out the show?
No, Sean, I just want to thank you again for having me on and for making the space for these type of conversations. For the audience, if you ever have any questions about learning Ignition or want to get started learning, you can always connect with me on LinkedIn or reach out to Inductive Automation through any of our various channels. We're always happy to talk to someone who wants to learn more about Ignition. And as speaking from someone in training, and as you know, Sean, as someone who trains, if you're passionate about learning Ignition, then we're going to be passionate to you about teaching Ignition.
Well, I hope you guys enjoyed that episode. I want to thank Kyle for taking time out of his busy schedule to meet with me after hours and give me that tutorial on getting started with Ignition. I thought that was so cool. And I love that he went into the parameters and doing faceplates that could be used with multiple different PLCs or groups of tags. So I hope you guys enjoyed that too. If you know anybody looking for PLC or HMI training, please recommend theautomationschool.com to them. That is how I keep the lights on. We get this really nice office now. I'd love to have you guys stop by. And if whether you're a vendor and you want to sponsor some content with us, or if you're somebody who wants to send your people in to get training or get training yourself, or even do some one-on-one mentoring, give me a buzz. You can find my phone number at theautomationschool.com. You also find a contact form and you can reach out to me there as well. And with that, I just want to wish you all good health and happiness. And until next time, my friends, peace.